This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system reaching a moment where it has to decide whether it still works. At a precise moment this morning, a line was drawn that almost didn't hold. Not quietly, not symbolically, in real time, on the record. What happened was not chaos. It was something more dangerous. A test of whether rules are still rules when they become inconvenient, a test of whether authority still means enforcement or just language, a test of how far disruption can go before the system blinks. You probably saw headlines. They don't tell you why this moment matters. They don't tell you what almost broke. Stay with me, because once you see how this unfolded, you can't unsee what comes next. And this story does not end where most coverage stops. If this matters to you, don't look away yet. The mechanism is just starting to surface. What actually controls the system is not its values. It's not its slogans. It's not even its laws. It's what happens when someone refuses to comply. Every system looks stable when everyone agrees to play along. Stability is easy when obedience is voluntary. The real structure only reveals itself when someone says no. For a long time, we've been taught to think power lives in offices, elections, and personalities. That's comforting. It makes failure feel personal instead of structural. But today wasn't about a person pushing boundaries. It was about whether enforcement still exists without negotiation, whether authority still functions without persuasion. Because here's the quiet truth. Modern systems don't collapse from attack. They erode when enforcement becomes optional and consequences become debatable. What unfolded wasn't noise. It was pressure applied at a very specific seam, a place where procedure meets defiance. And once that seam is stressed publicly, repeatedly, on the record, the system has only two choices: hold or adapt in ways it was never designed to survive. And that brings us to how this didn't start today. It started much earlier. So quietly, most people missed it. The most dangerous changes never arrive all at once. They arrive gradually. They arrive dressed as normal. There was a time when defiance inside formal institutions was unthinkable, not because people were better, but because the cost was immediate and visible. Then something shifted. Rules became suggestions. Warnings became negotiations. Sanctions became headlines instead of consequences. Before, disruption was rare and punished quickly. Now it's frequent and absorbed, normalized, explained away as strategy. And that's the trap. Slow change doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like adaptation. Each incident framed as isolated, each escalation justified as unique, until the system adjusts itself around the disruption instead of stopping it. That's what makes moments like today so dangerous. They don't come out of nowhere. They are the result of years of recalibration. Pressure applied. No snapback. So more pressure follows. What you're watching isn't a single breach. It's a stress fracture spreading quietly under load. And fractures don't announce when they become breaks. They just fail. Which brings us to the first visible shock, the moment when normalization stopped working. Here's where the system flinched. Not in theory, not in commentary. In a room where procedure is supposed to be automatic, what happened next wasn't loud at first. It was brief, a single break in rhythm, a voice where silence is required, an interruption where process depends on order. And for a moment, nothing moved. That pause matters more than the words spoken, because systems reveal their limits in hesitation, not reaction. A warning followed. Clear, direct, on the record. Then it happened again. Not confusion, not a mistake. Defiance repeated after authority was asserted. This is where most coverage gets it wrong. They frame this as a clash of personalities, as tempers, as drama. But this wasn't emotion. It was calibration. How far can this go before enforcement becomes unavoidable? How public does defiance need to be before consequences trigger automatically? The answer didn't come immediately. It stalled. It stretched. And in that stretch, the system exposed something fragile, because once enforcement has to be debated in real time, the danger isn't what happened. It's what was just invited to happen next. This is the part you're not supposed to notice, because when systems fail publicly, attention rushes to behavior. Who said what? Who crossed the line? But the real action happens underneath. Here's how the mechanism actually works. Disruption is cheap. Enforcement is expensive. Every time authority responds, it has to justify itself, explain itself, document itself. Defiance doesn't. Defiance only has to exist so the burden shifts, not to the person breaking the rules, but to the institution trying to hold them. Each warning increases the cost of the next step. Each pause raises the stakes. Each hesitation invites escalation. And someone always benefits from that imbalance. The person applying pressure gains leverage, visibility, narrative control. The system absorbs the risk, the delay, the doubt. This is why repeated disruption isn't chaos. It's strategy. Not to win immediately, but to make enforcement look optional, political, or excessive. And once that perception sets in, consequences stop being automatic. They become negotiable, which means the next shock won't look like a mistake. It will look intentional and faster. Then the pace changed. Warnings came closer together. Minutes, not hours. Defiance didn't soften. It sharpened. A sound, a movement, a refusal to comply. Authority responded not rhetorically, procedurally. Language shifted from guidance to command, from expectation to consequence. This is where systems either assert themselves or lose control. There is no third option, because once enforcement is named explicitly, backing down becomes impossible. Everyone in the room understood that. That's why time stretched. 12 minutes. Not empty, loaded. No one moved forward. No one retreated. When resolution finally came, it wasn't clean. It wasn't confident. It was forced, not by rules, by proximity, and that detail matters more than anything else so far. Because when enforcement depends on intervention instead of inevitability, the system has already crossed a line. And the next time, intervention may not be enough. Here's where this reaches you. Because systems don't fail in courtrooms first. They fail downstream. When enforcement becomes conditional at the top, it becomes optional everywhere else. You feel it when rules are applied unevenly. When delays become normal, when accountability depends on status, you're told to comply, to wait, to accept outcomes you didn't choose. And you do, because you assume someone, somewhere, is still in control. But moments like this shake that assumption. If authority has to negotiate in public, what happens when you don't have cameras, or lawyers, or leverage? This isn't about sympathy or outrage. It's about predictability, about whether systems still produce outcomes you can plan around. If this kind of breakdown can happen here, in the most formal setting imaginable, then it's not isolated. It's instructional. If you want to understand what comes next, not just here, but everywhere, pressure meets power. Stay with me, because this doesn't stop at one room. It never does. This is the moment where containment fails, because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They signal every institution watching learned something, not from the outcome, from the process. They learn how long enforcement takes, how public defiance is handled, where hesitation appears, and that information travels fast, not just domestically, across borders, across systems that already operate under pressure. When authority looks conditional in one place, it invites testing elsewhere. Not imitation, optimization. What worked once gets refined. What stalled enforcement gets repeated. This is how stress propagates, not through collapse, but through adaptation in the wrong direction. And suddenly, This isn't about one courtroom. It's about whether institutional authority still scales, whether rules can survive visibility, whether enforcement can survive scrutiny. Because once defiance becomes instructional, it stops being symbolic. It becomes contagious. And contagion doesn't ask permission. It just spreads, which leaves us facing a future that is no longer theoretical, just undecided. From here, the system moves faster. Not because anyone wants it to, because pressure does that. There are three paths forward. None of them are comfortable. The first is adjustment. Authority tightens. Enforcement becomes immediate. Disruption stops being tolerated because the cost of stopping it drops. The system reasserts itself, not loudly, decisively. The second is erosion. Nothing breaks all at once. Rules remain, but enforcement slows. Each exception justified, each delay normalized. The system still stands, but it no longer carries weight. It asks instead of commands. And then there is rupture. This is where defiance meets a hard stop, where enforcement finally arrives late, visible, unavoidable, and when it does, it shocks everything around it. Markets react, institutions polarize. Legitimacy fractures under the strain. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They reveal themselves through behavior, through the next test, and the one after that. We haven't crossed the threshold yet, but we are no longer standing still, and that makes the final question unavoidable. Nothing about this moment guarantees resolution. Systems don't fail because of villains. They fail because stress exposes what was already weak. What you saw wasn't a conclusion. It was a preview of what happens when authority has to prove itself in public. When enforcement becomes a performance, when consequences have to negotiate their own legitimacy, that is not stability. It's a holding pattern. And holding patterns don't last. The next test will come faster, with less warning, in a place that feels even more consequential. You won't always recognize it as a crisis. It will look procedural, ordinary, manageable, until it isn't. If you want to understand how systems signal before they break, how pressure accumulates before it shows, and how moments like this fit into something much larger, stay with me. Because this story didn't end today. It escalated, and the most dangerous phase always begins after everyone thinks the system held. I'll see you in the next one.